We all have a mother, right? That experience is inescapable. It's universal. We may have very different relationships with our mother, but no matter what kind of relationship or presence our mother has had for us, she's a central person in our lives.
Rebe Huntman is a dancer and a writer whose journey took an unexpected turn in midlife. After losing her mother at 19, Rebe carried that loss quietly for years. But as she got older, something shifted. She felt called to revisit the part of her life, the part that still felt unfinished. That path led her to Havana, where she explored not just the city's beauty and spirit, but her own story. And today she's here to share what that journey taught her, because for so many of us, midlife brings our mothers back into focus. Whether we're caring for them, missing them, or still working through things we haven't fully named, Rebe's story reminds us that we're never too old to revisit the past. So if you've ever felt the weight of an unfinished conversation or wondered how your mother's story still lives inside your own, this episode is for you. And if you want to hear more conversations like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I'm really interested in the book that you wrote. I have it right here. I took a lot of notes, but I won't ask all of those questions. But Rebe, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Holly. I'm delighted to be here.
I feel that your journey started long before you decided to write a book, and that it really was a lot about having lost your mom at a young age. What was going on in your life that her story started to come back to you and you wanted to learn more about her?
Yeah, so I lost my mother when I was 19, and I was a sophomore in college. I was just finding my way as a young woman in the world, and her loss was devastating. It just felt like the whole ground just opened up beneath me and swallowed me up, and I didn't have any tools to deal with that grief. Some very well-meaning people, college counselors included, really advised me. They use the conventional wisdom that I feel like we kind of travel by here in the US, which is, to move on, right? Don't spend too much time in grief, right? We need to move on to the other side of it. And the specific advice I got was to make something of myself, make my mother proud, focus on the tests the next week in college. So I took that advice to heart and I really moved on and kind of buried my grief. I found that it was very embarrassing to other people. Um, I was dating at the time, and the last thing a young man wants is for his girlfriend to start crying because she misses her mother. And so, for various reasons, I just really pushed her to the margins and kept moving in my life. And then something really mysterious happened when I was about to turn 50. I just couldn't push her memory back anymore. It just started bubbling up in such a big way. And one of the things that was most pronounced about it was that I hardly remembered her anymore because I'd done such a good job of pushing aside her memory. And so I couldn't really recall what she sounded like. I couldn't really remember the stories that she'd told me. I just knew that I loved my mother and I was aching for her and that I wanted to find a way back to her. And luckily for me, I had had a career as a Latin dancer and choreographer, which had taken me to Cuba to collaborate with choreographers there. So I was familiar with Cuba and I knew two things about the place that were very different from my own country. One was that Cuba, in my experience, was much more comfortable with the dead and had a number of spiritual practices that really normalized talking with the dead. So that when my Cuban friends, say, they don't say, I'm going to go speak with the spirit of my mother. They say, I'm going to go speak with my mother, right? The idea is that the ancestors are still with us, the dead are with us, and they're guiding and protecting us and whispering in our ear. And I wanted to lean into that invitation. I wanted to see where that would take me, to be in a place where that kind of relationship with the dead was normalized, was celebrated. And the other thing about Cuba that I knew about, again, because of my experience dancing there, was that they really revere the mother, both the biological mother. The mother is so central and strong and important, but also the spiritual mother. And she appears to her devotees in Cuba in a Catholic version as Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of Cuba, but also in many African incarnations. And the one I absolutely fell in love with was Oshun, the goddess of the rivers and water and fertility and love. And so I just had this sense as I was turning 50 and I was here in Ohio, of all places, and I was aching for my mother. And I knew it had to do with having somehow shoving that grief aside for all those years, but also myself being on the verge of turning, getting close to the age she was when she died. There was a lot of mystery. I think I'd always thought that by the time you're 50, you really feel like you're powerful and self possessed and you've got the answers to everything. And I didn't feel that way, and I longed to. So I set out on this quest to Cuba to see what the Afro Cuban spiritual traditions might have to show me about communicating with the dead and also about being a woman, right? What was this kind of new, this larger template um, of what a woman might be that I saw in the celebrations of the spiritual mother there?
I think Cuba feels like so much of a mystery to a lot of us because there isn't as much connection, even though it's what 90 miles off the shore of the United States. I found it fascinating though that they're so devoted, like you said, to the mother. What was it like when you were there and you realized, did it feel like coming home or was it scary?
How about both? I think all the best quests involve both the sense of being at exactly the place you need to be. I'm sure that anybody listening here can today has had an experience sometime in their life where something, pulled, you feel something tugging at your heartstrings, or there's something that is calling to you, and it may not even be rational or linear or make sense, but you just feel it in your gut. And that's how going to Cuba felt to me. And it also feels very much like home to me in that I've spent, my life speaking Spanish and working as a Latin dancer and working as a teacher in Spanish speaking communities. And so Spanish is feels very much at home to me. Being in Latin America feels very at home to me in a way that I've never been able to explain. It just does. It really resonates with me. Latin dance felt that way. The first time I heard Latin dance music, I just felt like I'd come home. I had grown up in St. Louis in the suburbs, as far away from Cuba and those rhythms as you could. And so the first time I heard them, there's something magic that just snapped inside me. And I said, this is it. This is what I want to do with my life. This is how I want to feel. So in that sense, it felt very much at home to go to Cuba. And I'd been there before, and I was very fortunate to have some brilliant contacts that opened up the worlds of seance and pilgrimage and Santeria initiations and just all kinds of magic and miracle to me. So I was really in good hands. But it's uncomfortable. It's terrifying to set out on a quest where, you know, you want I wanted to come home changed. I went to Cuba to remake myself. I didn't want to be a 50-year-old woman who felt like a 19-year-old girl who was still grieving her mother. I wanted to connect with my mother. I wanted to feel her again, and I wanted to connect with myself. So that's very scary, to go on a quest where you know that you're trying to remake yourself. And when you come home, maybe not, the people who you love will recognize you.
Yes, because how much are you going to change during that period? How much time did you give yourself?
So I was in Cuba for 30 days on that particular. So in the pages of my mother in Havana, I'm recounting the 30 days that I spent in 2013 when I was specifically there to connect with these spiritual traditions, to connect with my mother. I spent 15 of those days in Havana working with Santeria priests and priestesses, and where I was really invited into a really beautiful world of ceremony and ritual and sacrifice and sacred dance, and getting to know Oshun, the river goddess, and through her, you know, um, finding a more multifaceted and larger version of both myself and my mother. And then I traveled to the east of Cuba, where Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of the island, her sanctuary is there. And there are these beautiful pilgrimages tens of thousands strong, where people come from all over the island of Cuba, some on hands and foot. I had read, and it was true, that some arrive on their hands and foot and they come in this act of devotion to the spiritual mother of Cuba. And I really wanted to witness that. I had no reference for that. Growing up here in the US, we had Mother's Day, um, but I couldn't think of a single other celebration that would even come close to that kind of an outpouring of love and devotion for the mother. So that was my map. Um, and then I say that I made a point of saying that that's what I write about here in the book. I went back numerous times as I was writing the book to continue my research, to continue my initiations and my understanding of the spiritual traditions that I write about in the book. And really trying to get the answers that I set out to get here in the book, which is how do we communicate? How do we connect with our lost beloveds? When they're gone and we don't really remember them, how can we reach our hand across that veil? And is it possible? And is it real? And what is over on that other side? How do you do that? And then the other question had to do with, connecting with the spiritual mothers of Cuba. So those two things really set me out on a journey that kept me busy for about a decade writing this book.
Could you tell us a little bit about your mom and ways that you still try to remember her now?
Absolutely. So, I always say, there's not one of us listening today who has been able to escape the reality of we are all brought into this world through a mother. We all have a mother, right? That experience is inescapable. It's universal. We may have very different relationships with our mother, and some of us have an absent mother, or some of us have difficult relationship with our mother. But no matter what kind of relationship or presence our mother has had for us, she's a central she's a central person in our lives. And for my mother, she was absolutely central. She had been 40 years old when I was born. My siblings were already teenagers. My mother did not have a very happy marriage with my father. He was not as good to her as I wish he had been. Um, and I think that I was her second chance in some ways, right? Like as she moved into that part of her life that I'm then moving into as I'm writing this book, she had a lot of time to devote to me. I was really the center of a lot of her attention, and I felt very loved. And I felt her presence very strongly. There's a story I tell towards the beginning of the book that when I was 10 years old, my parents and I went to Mexico to a little town called Puerto Angel, which is in the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. And we were swimming, and my mother and I got caught in an undertow. We got pulled a mile out from shore. We were drowning. I mean, and there was no one on the beach but us and my father. My father had been taking photographs of us when we got pulled out to sea. And he threw the camera down on the beach and jumped in after us, but, he was no match for those waters either. Um, Eventually, help came for us. But in the meantime, what I remember about that time was that my mother held me. She never let go of me. And I mean, the waters were fierce and they were pulling us under. And then we'd come up for air and she would tell me to yell for help. And then we'd get sucked under again. And it was terrifying. And she never let go, right? So while it was professional coral sea divers that actually saved us, that wouldn't have been possible if my mother had ever let go of me. So there's this sense of, and I think this is something that I held on to, even while all the other details about my mother, like the smell of her perfume or the sound of her voice, all that fell away over the years. But that sense of having someone that will never let you go really stuck with me. And that was what I was searching for in Cuba. So if that's gone in the sense of, and some of us never have that, or never have that experience of feeling that certain of it, but we long for it, right? Like,
Oh,
where
yeah.
is that person? Well, who's got us? And so for me, it was if that person who I felt had me is no longer there, if in essence, because no one can live forever. Everyone eventually has to let go, right? So what really has us? And what is that presence that holds us? And that really fueled this investigation into the spiritual mothers of Cuba, because we don't commune with that or traffic in that language a lot here in the US. But in Cuba they do, in this sense of really being held by a divine presence that's feminine and that's motherly and that doesn't go away because it's eternal.
Had your mom ever gotten to go to Cuba?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and that was really a blessing because as I was writing the book, I found four photographs from my parents. They went to Cuba in 1951. And that allowed me to see my mother as a 20, she was 20, in her early 20s in 1951 or mid 20s. And to really begin conversation with her, like really imagine into one of the things that I do in the pages of My Mother in Havana is at times I imagine into my mother and father being there in 1951 and what she would have made of some of these things. And it allowed me to really connect with her on a really profound level and kind of talk woman to woman with her about this shared experience, even though we didn't share it at the same time. So yeah. And then, you asked me in the previous question, and I never got around to answering it, but you asked how I continue to honor my mother, and I didn't want to let that go. I learned a lot in Cuba, and I share a lot in the book about how I learned to communicate with the dead and keep the dead close. And a lot of it, I mean, a lot of it is too much to go into in a simple answer, but it is all in the book. And but the one thing that is so simple that I learned that I can't believe I had to go all the way to Cuba to learn it is just to keep a photograph of her close by and light a candle and talk to her on a regular basis. So I have an ancestral altar in my home, and I have all my ancestors out. My mother's right in the middle. My dad's next to her. My grandmothers and my grandfathers are there. So, my stepmother, all kinds of people are represented. And every day I walk by and it's like, hey, how are you guys doing? And it can be as simple as that, or sometimes it can be, I'm having a problem and I can come to the altar and come to my mother and say, Mom, I really need your help. So it can, but it's so simple. And what I love about it is that it makes it a daily practice, right? Because she's right there and I pass her and I can talk to her and feel like she's with me. And, in Cuba, these, when I talk about the Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions, they came over from Africa when enslaved people were brought to Cuba. And these traditions of, in for example, in Nigeria, the Yoruba buried their dead under the floorboards of the house because, of course, you're going to keep your dead with you, right? And they're right there under the floorboards, so you can just kind of tap your foot and say, "Hey, Grandpa," or, they're part of the daily life, and that's something that I learned how to keep that going. And one of the things I say in the book, toward the end is this could all be a bunch of mumbo jumbo, right? Like there's a part of
Yes.
me. And I think that's one of the things that I had the most fun in the book is being really honest about the fact that I yearn to believe in all this stuff and believe in magic and miracle and believe in talking with the dead and believe that they're there listening to us. But there's also a part of me that realizes I don't know for sure. And, there's the doubter in me, and I have to keep her in check because she's not a lot of fun. It's a lot more, I think about either my mother is there on the other side and she's there when I'm talking to her, or she's not. And if she's not there and I'm talking to her, then I look like a lunatic. And that's much more preferable to the alternative, which is what if I'm not talking to her and she is there? That seems so grievous,
Yes. Oh, I didn't think of it that way. Right? That would
right?
be you were talking about the story with your mom a little while ago. Like I started to get a little emotional because you're right. I don't think as we age that um all of us have not had that type of relationship with their mom, especially when you get to your 50s and 60s and I think you look back on life, there's a lot that we missed out on and it's hard. It's difficult. So I could understand sorry, but I could understand your search for her and it just sounds like such a fascinating place to do that.
Well, Cuba is a very special place. And, I love that you mentioned at the beginning, we as a country know so little about it. And it's so close. It's 90 miles, Havana is 90 miles from Miami. But the culture there is so full of life. And I really think that one of the main reasons is there's such a confluence of different spiritual traditions on that one island. And so, there's, a very strong Catholic tradition, and that's beautiful in its own right. It brings all
Mhm.
this beautiful, like I said, Our Lady of Charity she's an incarnation of the Mother Mary, and she's so strongly revered. So you've got this whole Catholic tradition of revering the spiritual mother and of faith, and it takes on its own kind of flavor in Cuba as well. But there are also all of these African influences. And Santeria is probably the most well-known of the traditions, but there are a number of traditions, and Santeria is one of them. And for anybody who's not familiar with what Santeria is, it's a religion that is the result of the enslaved Africans being brought to Cuba, bringing their own religion, their own gods with them, and then being forced to convert to Catholicism. And in order to preserve their own religion, they syncretized the two. They looked at the Catholic saints and said, okay, you want me to bow to that Mother Mary? She looks an awful lot like our mother, Oshun, for example, the river deity. So we will we will talk with your Mother Mary, but in our hearts we're talking to, Oshun. And so there's this real blending of faiths and religions and deities. And it brings these really rich traditions. There's a tradition of spiritism. One of the things that I did when I was in Cuba that I write about in the book is I met with a spiritist who talks with the dead and summons it's this rich tradition of mediumship,
Mhm.
of being able to speak with and summon the dead. And that's part of it. And part of these traditions is they're not like, when I grew up in the Protestant Congregational Church, and it was very orderly and very,
Yes.
and pretty sterile, right?
Yeah.
Unlike Catholicism, where you have all the saints and all the good stuff. In my church, it was very, there was a crucifix unadorned. In a lot of these Afro-Cuban traditions, the relationship with the gods, you don't go and listen to someone tell you about God. You actually commune directly with the gods. And one of the ways you do that is through music and dance and art. And so there's, when you talk about Cuba being alive, there's this almost a hum there because of all this, the drumming and the dance and the offerings to the gods that are so much embedded in daily practice for so many people there, that it feels very, very alive in a way that is very, very different from daily life here in the US. The spiritual is infused in everything.
Could you give an example? How did you experience that when you were there?
Yeah. So the first time I went, um, which is not, again, when the pages of the book are from my trips in 2013. My first trip was actually in 2004. When I went in 2004, I went in my role as a professional Latin dancer, and I went to work with with choreographers in Cuba and Havana. And one of the things I learned very quickly is that these dances that I had studied and performed and taught and coached professionally, all these Latin rhythms had their roots in the sacred dances of Cuba and of the Afro-Cuban gods, who are called orishas. And what I mean by that is the dance at its root was not a form of entertainment or showmanship, but actually a way to commune with the gods. So in the Afro-Cuban pantheon, each god has its own way of being in the world. And when I say each god, it is a monotheistic religion. There's one god at the top. But that God, Oludumare, it's too vast for us to comprehend. Just like for many of us, no matter what our version of God is, it seems very abstract and very out there and a lot to comprehend. And so in Santeria, they God comes to us through all these intermediary deities, right? And one of them is the one I've been talking about so much so far, Oshun, the river deity, right? She has her own rhythm. She has her own way of being. She's very coquettish. She's very sensual. She's the goddess of love and beauty. She is always looking in her mirror, not because she's narcissistic, but because she knows her worth, right? And so she has certain rhythms, certain colors, certain patterns that resonate with her. And so to dance her dance, right, is to dance like the river and to embody the river because she's the goddess of the river. So your steps mimic the river. The way you move your skirts, right, is to mimic the waves,
Okay.
right? Your actions are to mimic her actions. And by doing that, and by also doing that by being accompanied by the drum beats that she likes, you're actually able, according to Santeria, you're able to summon her so that you actually become her. She inhabits you. She's able to come from the heavens and descend and mount you, or I mean, that's the word they use, montar, but it doesn't sound that great in English. But you know,
Yeah.
you incarnate as her, and for that time period. So for an hour or 2 hours or 15 minutes, whatever it is, you become the river goddess because you've invoked her through these actions and these rhythms. The first time I saw that, it changed everything for me. It was in 2004, the first time I went to Cuba, and the choreographer I was working with took me to a nightclub, not a nightclub like we would think of here. Um, it was a very intimate space in a basement, and there were dancers there that were there not to dance as showmanship or entertainment, but to invoke the gods. And I watched their earthly selves just disappear. I watched, you know, their eyes would roll back in their head. They would become the god or goddess
Hmm.
that they were invoking. And everyone around, you know, got caught up in the spirit, and I did too. And it changed everything that I thought about dance because for me, it had always been about showmanship. It had been about being the best, right? Teaching other people how to be the best, how to get the technique right. But in Cuba, it's not about getting it right in the sense that we think about it. It's about really becoming one with one of the gods. So part of the idea of Santeria is that we each have a guardian orisha. So it gets back to that sense of feeling alone. And I know you got teary, and I do too. And I think about like, who is it that's holding us, right? Who is it
Yeah.
that's got us? And in Santeria, the idea is that you not only have, you know, your mother, your father, your sisters, your brothers, whoever might have you on the earthly realm, you have or not, you have a guardian orisha, and you are aligned with them, and they are there watching out for you all the time, right? So it might be Oshun, the river goddess, or it
Hmm.
might be Chango, the king of the drums, or, you know, there's all these different intermediary gods, but there's one in particular that you're aligned with and who's there to guide you and show you the way, show you how to move through life.
Did you find a god or spirit or however you want to describe it that you connected with when you were there?
Absolutely. And I connected with her immediately. And that is Oshun. That's why I've been talking about her so much. And she's really a key character in the book because I learned so much from her. She's a great teacher. She's a great guardian Orisha. She knows all about how to move through the world as a woman in full possession of herself, right? A woman who is mighty in spirit and, you know, in beauty, but not beauty like we think of in a superficial way, but like a deep, you know, beauty and wisdom and strength. And so yeah, she announced herself to me pretty quickly. I was very attracted to her when I first saw her movements, when I first learned about her. She's also syncretized. She's the deity that's syncretized with Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of Cuba. So Cuba's pretty taken with Oshun. I'm not alone. And the symbol that ties those two spiritual mothers together is the sunflower, which is why I'm wearing sunflowers, and it's
Oh,
why there's a sunflower on the front of my book, because this is a symbol that kind of unites the Catholic mother and the Afro-Cuban mother, is the sunflower.
oh, it's very interesting. Now that you're back here in the United States, do you feel, how can I say this? Like when you're there and the way that the people in Cuba honor the mother, did you feel then that they're not as sad about the loss because they don't disconnect from it? There's still that contact there.
I don't ever want to speak for anyone else. I can say that my assumption is that people must feel very different in Cuba than we do because I feel very different after what I've learned in Cuba. It's night and day, this concept, such a gift, and that's why I wanted to write this book and share it with everybody because it's such a different lens. It's such a different way of thinking about our connection with ourselves, with our loved ones, with our departeds. It's been so healing to me to be given that the tools, which I share in the book, obviously, the tools to talk with the dead and the permission to talk with the dead. That was one of the reasons I went to Cuba because I felt like my whole life here, there was a sense that there was something shameful about missing your mother, and there was something shameful about prolonged grief. And I found healing in Cuba because there's so much permission, and that permission is they're not gone. They're right there with you, and that we have these tools and we have these abilities to communicate and stay in contact on a daily basis and in a profound way with our departed.
For someone who is maybe grieving, what does that permission look like? Is there a way that you can describe it?
Yeah, I think, and again, I can't speak for everybody. I
Mm-hmm.
had an experience. I learned a lot. I like to say when people ask me that question, I like to think about what I would say to my 19-year-old self, right? Um, because I am not in the position to dispense wisdom to the whole,
Sure.
to the whole world, but I am to my 19-year-old self, and this is what I would have told my 19-year-old self is to lean into the missing, to lean into the grief. You can't escape it. You've lost someone that was important to you, right? And we will never move on from that. The idea that we can move on from that kind of missing um, is feels really inadequate. Um, and so the permission I feel that grieving is a way of holding on to a person. You're not going to grieve forever. You'll eventually, I mean, you'll get up and you'll go to work, right? I think I feared too much that it would absolutely disable me. But even if you know, I wish I'd written more at that time. I wish I'd written down every story that I could remember that my mother had told me. I wish I'd written down the name of her perfume and the name of her lipstick and, just the funny words. I know she really liked words and thought certain words were funny, but I can't remember what the words were. And it'd be so much fun to have really held on to those things and not been embarrassed to do that. So the first thing is, not to feel the shame that it's really natural to miss someone that you've lost. And then the second is a reaching for the tools to keep them close, right? Don't be afraid that people are going to think you're crazy if you're talking to your dead mother, right? It's the most normal, healthy thing in the world, according to how I feel now after being through everything that I have and seeing how normalized that is in Cuba, right? That there is another, we tend to see things through our own culture's lens. This is the beauty of stepping outside your own culture sometimes is you see, wow, there's a whole other way of seeing things.
I do love those traditions, and I think that there's something fascinating about them. But it did have to take a little bit of courage on your part to write this kind of story because you said before that if you thought that you were talking to someone or that the belief wasn't really there, that you would feel kind of goofy doing that. Did you feel that you had to sum up some courage to write this story?
Sure, of course. I mean, I wrote, I wrote down, I mean, I wrote so much from the heart, and I wanted to write this book so honestly. And I wanted it to be an offering. um, the cover, I keep picking up the book, but the cover is an offering. This is done by a Cuban artist, who's a friend of mine, and it's called Annunciation, the Great Offering. And I wanted this book to be an offering to people who, like me, might be looking either to connect with a lost beloved or to connect with themselves at a very deep, very real way. To anybody who's wondering what's holding us, right? There's so much unknown and so much terror in the world in many ways. So what's got us? Who's got our back? What's out there? And I've had so many people come to me and thank me for writing the book and talk to me about how healing it's been for them and in a number of ways. And so I'm really glad that I A had the courage to go to Cuba and B to write about it because I think a lot of times we're really worried that other people are going to think we're weird or whatever. But there's other people out there that are feeling weird too, and that have the same questions you have, and that are, you know, on the same path, and or maybe they haven't, they've never thought of these things. But I feel like it's important. It was important to me to be very honest in this book and to carry my readers with me. Again, like I said earlier, there's this push and pull in the book between is this real? Do I believe this? Do I not believe this? Oh, I really want to believe this. I really want to connect with my mother. I really want to connect with the spirit. What if I just look goofy? What if it's, you know, there's this push pull
Mhm.
that I think is important because I think we all go through that. None of us is 100%, well, there's definitely this or definitely that. So there's a lot of, like I say, knocking on doors of the spirit world. Does this door open? Does it really open? What's behind it? And I wanted to bring my reader with me. I knew when I came back from Cuba that I'd had an extraordinary experience and one that I was really fortunate to have and one that I really needed to share.
Do you still try to maintain that level of sort of connection? You said you have a little altar in your home, but is there any other ways that you feel you've brought a little bit of Cuba home with you?
Yeah, I would say I've brought a lot of Cuba home with me, and I continue to go. I was there just a few months ago. The book came out in February, and in March, I went back to Cuba to hand deliver copies of the book to people who either helped me with it or who are in the book. And that was a really extraordinary trip. So I continue to engage with these practices, mainly when
Mhm.
I'm in Cuba, but also to the best of my ability here when I'm home as well. And they take a number of different, flavors and textures, but the principal one and that core one, and if your listeners got one thing, one tool, from today from listening, it's that just that very simple practice of keeping the photograph out and talking on a daily basis and in a very normalized way to those that we love.
It's an odd practice to get into, but when you do it, I think it does ease your heart a little bit, and it does feel good to
Yeah.
continue to keep that memory alive. You mentioned journaling was a way in which you kept notes and things when you were writing the book. Is that something you still practice now? Do you still write things
Yes.
down?
I'm a fierce journaler. I write everything down, and I make my own journals and I decorate the covers, and I mean it's a big deal to me. It feels like a very there's something about the practice of keeping a journal that feels very much like no matter what I'm writing, what I'm really writing is, hey, I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here on this earth. I'm here. I'm making marks on these pages. It must be proof that I'm here. But I write down everything from grocery lists to like profound thoughts to, quotes I hear that I really love. And when I was in Cuba, I took copious notes. I took just because I was experiencing all of these things, and I had contact with all these incredible people, and so I wrote everything down. And for those who will read my book, you'll see that I then miraculously lose my journal while I'm in Cuba. Um, but I had transferred all the notes to my laptop as well, and I used my voice memo, to
Hmm.
record things. So I'm really big on. I wanted this book. Let's face it, I'm an outsider to Cuba culture. I'm not Cuban. My mother wasn't Cuban. And I felt a great responsibility and love and devotion to getting everything right. So if I was going to convey to my readers what Santeria was like and what these rituals and practices were like, I wanted to really get it right and pin it down. And so the research in the book was really important. The interviews that I conducted in Cuba were really, really important. And that rigor of really keeping notes and really, getting the facts right was super, super important to me.
Can I read a little something from the book? Because it was something that stuck with me, and I think it's something that a lot of women, as we approach midlife, we can relate to. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
love it.
It's you wrote here. It said, "No matter how many steps I've mastered or how many trophies I've won, I will always feel like the girl at the sixth grade dance, an object waiting to be picked or picked over. And more than ever, as I approach 50, the idea of exposing myself, a middle-aged body, seems all the more unbearable." What were you feeling when you wrote that?
I was feeling that's part of that honesty and I mean that's how I felt a lot, but in that particular moment I think that I'm at a nightclub in Cuba and I am very aware of the fact that if you had seen me in my height of my career as a Latin dancer, you would never have guessed that I was a woman who felt that way. I knew how to turn it on for an audience. I looked to be completely in possession of myself, to be absolutely sure of myself, certain of myself. And yet I always felt that way inside. Like I'm waiting, what, even before I was, obviously talking about being a 50-year-old body is very specific to that
Hmm.
age. But that uncertainty and that trepidation, I think, and it's funny because every time I talk about the book with a group of women, they all do this. When I talk about, like, for me, it felt like I was the only person that when I turned 50, I was surprised that I felt like that little girl waiting to be, asked to dance or still missing her mother. And everybody in the audience always goes, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Like, I think there's this real disconnect between who we project to the world or who we think we should project to the world and how we really feel on the inside. And that was something that was really interested in this book. We've talked a lot about the relationship with the dead, but this relationship with the self as a woman and permission to be larger than life, not in the way that our culture here in the US delivers to us, which I feel is a very superficial way. Like, here's the template for how you do it. You get plastic surgery. You do, like here's the steps to
Yes.
becoming that have nothing to do with how you feel inside, right?
Right.
I always got the sense that there was this rule book out there. I never actually saw it, but I knew it was out there. It was like, this is how you're supposed to be as a woman, and this is how you're supposed to dress, and this is how you're supposed to talk, and people will like you if you do this, and they won't like you if you do that. And it's exhausting, right? And my
Yes.
whole life, I feel like I tried to live up to that rule book. And then I went to Cuba and saw these really powerful women that make up their own rules and these spiritual mothers. And that was one of the things I really wanted to convey in my book. And I hope it really comes across is this communion with that kind of sense of this larger than lifeness we can be and the permission to decide for ourselves what space we want to occupy it and how.
I want to say thank you for writing this book because it is absolutely beautiful, and I think not just for someone who is missing their mom, but just for women in general, because I did get the sense that there's power in here and we have it in ourselves, and I want to thank you for putting that in words for us to read.
Thank you. Thank you. And so thank you so much for having me here. It's been such a delightful time having this conversation. So thank you.
Before we go though, are you working on anything else? Like where can we find you or follow along on your journey?
Yeah, thank you. I'm always working on something. I am working currently on a poetry collection, which is all about being about woman and motherhood and female power and lack of power sometimes and all of those things. It's called Zinnias in My Mother's Vase. Um, but people can connect with me. You can find me on my website, rebehuntman.com. There are links to my mother in Havana there, but really this book is available anywhere books are sold. And you can find me on Instagram at Rebe Huntman.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time and being here today. I so enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you for joining us on Real Wisdom. If you're inspired by stories like this and want to be part of a community that celebrates the wisdom of women, visit joinempart.com and become a part of our conversation. And don't forget to subscribe for even more real wisdom. Until next time, keep embracing your story.